Good morning to those on the East Coast. Good afternoon and good evening to many of you in other parts of the world, especially in Europe. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion about Russia's war in Ukraine. We are approaching a 2-week marker since this war broke out. Today, I am joined by a group of excellent scholars from FPRI's network. Katia Glod is with us. She is an independent analyst and political risk consultant based in London. She advises on the politics and economics of the former Soviet countries with emphasis on Belarus. Gabriela Rosa-Hernandez is a fellow in our Eurasia Program. Eilish Hart is a Black Sea fellow in our Eurasia Program, and she's also an editor at Meduza, a Riga-based outlet covering Russia and former Soviet Union. Indra Ekmanis is a Baltic Sea fellow at FPRI, and she's also the editor of our Baltic Bulletin and the host of our Baltic Ways podcast. Today, what I thought we could do is ask Eilish to get us started and set the stage, tell us how the humanitarian crisis has shaped over the past couple of weeks. And then I will turn it over to Katia so she can tell us a little bit about the perspective from Belarus and Belarus's role in this war. Then I'll turn it over to Indra and finally Gabriela. We'll just make quick remarks and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature, send in your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can. Eilish, let's get started with you.
Thank you, Maya. So the long story short of what we've seen over the last 2 weeks is that the Ukrainian side is holding their ground, but it's coming at a very great humanitarian cost. So the Russian military is making inroads, particularly in the south of Ukraine. Kherson is the only major city that has been captured by the Russian military. But I would point out that even there, we're seeing, civilian resistance. We're seeing a lot of pushback. So perhaps we should say captured with a grain of salt. The Russian military is making less progress kind of in the north and northeast parts of Ukraine. However, we're seeing, very severe damage to major cities like Kharkiv has been, absolutely pummeled by airstrikes. We're seeing a lot of destruction to civilian infrastructure. We're seeing universities destroyed, for example, things like that. And then the outlying areas of Kyiv are also coming under, constant bombardment in outlying cities like Irpin and Bucha, for example. And so these are sort of the areas where we're seeing the sides attempt these humanitarian corridors to try and evacuate people. Ukraine has seen untold amount of internal displacement. We know, according to the UN, that at least 2 million people have fled the country entirely. So you have 2 million refugees in other parts of Europe. The displacement inside the country, we don't frankly have numbers on. We, like I said, are seeing these attempts to have humanitarian corridors and evacuate people from some of the hardest hit cities, but these have had very limited success. The key success story that we've seen was yesterday's evacuation from Sumy, according to local officials in the Poltava region, which is where people were taken to. They managed to get 5,000 people out of the city. But I mean, that's a small number compared to the number of people that are under siege in Mariupol right now. For example, I know earlier today, Ukraine's foreign minister said that, there's several hundred thousand people being essentially held hostage there. They haven't had heat. They haven't had electricity for several days, since at least last Friday, as far as I'm aware. And, you're seeing major cities starting to run out of medicines, run out of food, and at the same time, attempts to evacuate people are failing because the humanitarian corridors themselves are coming under attack by Russian forces. We've seen reports of humanitarian convoys being shelled. There have been civilians killed while trying to evacuate. So I think that it doesn't really give us a lot of hope for, getting people to safety. And I would also like to underscore that the evacuations that are taking place are removing people to relative safety. If you're evacuating from a suburb of Kyiv that's been razed to the ground, you're being brought into the city, which is, not facing the same amount of destruction at the moment. But a lot of people who are evacuating don't know where they're going, they don't know their final destination, and they don't know if they're moving to somewhere that could be the next target. I think, one of the things that's really been a hallmark of this war so far has been the degree to which it's clear that civilian infrastructure is being targeted. And this just isn't just coming from the Ukrainian side. This is being confirmed by, the UN, the World Health Organization, that we're seeing hospitals, schools, just civilian infrastructure that don't serve a military purpose that are coming under attack. Even within the last hour, I saw reports of a maternity hospital in Mariupol being shelled, and there's supposed to be a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol today as we speak. So the humanitarian situation is definitely very dire, and obviously this is going to be the subject of future negotiations. We have the Ukrainian foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister are supposed to meet in Turkey tomorrow. Whether or not we'll see any progress after that remains to be seen. And I'll hand it back to you, Maya, because I'm sure we'll come back to that later.
Right, Eilish, thank you so much. We have over 2 million people displaced and counting. And as you explained, there's still no safe, sustainable way for them to make their way to safety. I think it is these images of civilian casualties that has, outraged the world. And this is where why we've been seeing so much protest even within Russia. But there's another major player in this conflict, and that is Belarus, or I should say the president of Belarus, Lukashenko. I want to turn it over to Katia. Maybe she could explain to us what's the environment like in Belarus right now. I cannot imagine that Belarusians support this war. And how is this being received there? And what is actually the humanitarian situation within Belarus at the moment?
Yes, yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, Maya, and thank you for having me on this seminar. On this panel, it would be great to discuss issues and also Belarus involvement in the whole situation. Well, basically, we know that Belarus is an aggressor, that Belarus is actively providing its ground for Russian troops to move to Ukraine, also for Russian artillery, for Russian Air Force. There have been numerous reports from private reports and also media reports, particularly in the first few days of the war, of Russian troops and military vehicles being moved across Belarus towards the Ukrainian border. There have been numerous reports of helicopters and military jets taking off from Belarusian military airports and landing there. And we know that Ukraine has been attacked from the side of Belarus. So there is no question that Belarus has, under international law, become an aggressor in this campaign of assault on Ukraine. Although there have been some reports of Belarusian soldiers actually taking part in fighting along with Russian troops, there has been no confirmation of that. And I think the British and US intelligence a few days ago also confirmed that according to their intelligence, there had been no involvement of Belarusian troops. Having said that, we know that Lukashenko also gave orders to beef up the southern border of Belarus, and this is the part that borders Ukraine, obviously. So several military troops have been brought in from the west of the country, particularly, again, heavy artillery, tanks, etc., and they're still stationed there on the southern borders. There have been also, what we know, there has been a new army drafting campaign announced about a week ago in Belarus, and it was shifted several weeks earlier. Usually it takes place at the end of March. Again, there has been speculation that that was done in order for Belarusian military to be ready to join the Russian troops. But as said before, there have been no any confirmed reports that Belarusians are fighting along the Russian troops. On the contrary, the Belarusian officials have been trying very hard to rebuff this. We have seen many videos prepared by the authorities of Belarusian soldiers saying that they are stationed where they are and that they are in Belarus, they are not taking part in the assault against Ukraine. But again, having said that, I think it's quite clear within society in Belarus and internationally that if there is need, if Putin asks Lukashenko to provide extra support, then Lukashenko would not hesitate to do that. And in fact, at the beginning of the war, I think on the 27th of February, that's what Lukashenko also said in his meeting with the Belarusian Security Council. He used exactly these words, that if there is need for Belarus and for Russia, for Belarus to participate in this so-called military operation, then we'll do that. Obviously, that was his rhetoric. I think he would try to restrain from this, from doing that as much as he can. But we know that over the past 18 months, since the August 2020 presidential election, Lukashenko has really lost his space of maneuvering with Putin, and we can now basically say that Belarus has become more or less a puppet government, and Lukashenko is fully controlled, particularly in terms of defense. He is fully controlled by Putin, and all that comes from the legitimacy that Putin gives to him politically, first of all, and in economic terms as well. As Lukashenko is highly dependent on Putin, so there is all reason to believe that should there be need for Belarusian troops to participate in the war, then Lukashenko would give his command to do that. Again, having said that, I think public opinion, general public opinion, and also within the government, within the military officials in Belarus, I think it's very negative against the war. We saw some figures released just before the start of the attack on Ukraine from a Chatham House poll, which was conducted online, so it includes only urban population, but Belarus is quite urbanized. Over more than 80% of people live in the urban areas, and the figures were the following: that basically 80%, around 79% of people were against Belarusian soldiers having to die for Ukraine. That's how the question was, sorry, having to die for Russian military goals. This is how the question was formulated. About 60% of people, and that was conducted, just to remind you, the poll was conducted when we didn't know that the war would happen. So 60% of people in Belarus were saying that Belarus should remain neutral in the war, and also about 60% thought that Belarus potential participation in the war would be a catastrophe for Belarus. And I think we can clearly say that since the start of the attacks on Ukraine, these figures have come up. So public opinion is very negative. We saw people in Belarus protesting against the war. The main protests took place on the 27th of February on Sunday, and that was also the day of a referendum on the constitutional changes that through which Lukashenko hopes to strengthen his power. We saw people coming out across the country to polling stations, to main squares and streets. Obviously, in the current climate of repression in Belarus, it's quite hard to protest, but about 908 people, I think, were detained following these protests. But so Belarusians, nonetheless, they continue to protest in now more kind of individual fashion and format. There is also a big humanitarian effort within the country and through the Belarusian diasporas abroad to help Ukrainians. As well as there have been quite a few confirmed reports of Belarusians participating in international territorial defense units in Ukraine, although that's under the current legislation in Belarus, it's considered to be a criminal offense. So I will probably stop here and I would be happy to answer the questions.
Thank you so much, Katia. I want to remind our audience members that they can use the Q&A feature at any time to send in their questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Indra. The Baltic countries have all along been very avid supporters of Ukraine, but also of the Eastern Neighborhood Policy countries. You know, of course, it's wonderful to have this kind of solidarity for Ukraine, but the truth is, again, we're going to be exceeding 2 million refugees at this point. How do you assess Europe's capacity to actually take in the refugees? And at what point will, is there an ending point to this kind of solidarity where then it's just a crisis, where there's no more capacity to take in people, right? How much longer can this go on?
Yeah, well, thank you, Maya, for that question. It's not an easy one to answer, right? Of course, we have seen kind of tremendous solidarity from Europe in response to this humanitarian crisis, right? Very quickly opening borders, very quickly kind of eliminating some visa requirements or asylum proceedings, waiving those kind of bureaucratic barriers for Ukrainian refugees. And of course, the Ukrainian refugee experience is, if you put a black and white sort of filter on any of these images, it's something that is extremely reminiscent of kind of World War II imagery, right? So something that is very close to the European experience. We've seen kind of remarkable outpourings of mutual aid groups, of individual donations. I think within the first few days, some 4 million euros was raised in Latvia, and considering this is a population of less than 2 million, it's quite a significant kind of popular support. You can see mutual aid groups kind of posting information about how to find housing in Riga or in other parts of the country, how to find food resources or even job resources. So right now there seems to be a generosity of spirit that, we can also probably have to acknowledge a generosity of spirit that has not been so easily forthcoming in the case of other refugee kind of crises. Very recently, of course, we have a refugee crisis on Baltic borders with Belarus, right? So we see a difference here, and it's quite, in some ways, amazing how quickly these policies changed in order to accommodate Ukrainians. The optimist in me hopes that this is kind of the impetus for broader policy change, right? That can be applied more broadly because the humanitarian crisis is not limited to Ukrainians in the world right now, although we're obviously centering Ukrainians in this discussion, as we should. How long the generosity lasts, I mean, that is quite an open question. You know, you can kind of see even a little bit of already fatigue from watching the war. I think more broadly, right? Like the first days were of course like this horrendous shock to a broad populace, but like many conflicts, unfortunately, once it becomes the drumbeat, it just is the drumbeat in the background, and how to maintain a focus on kind of the atrocity of the war will probably be a challenge the longer it drags on.
Yeah.
That is not an easy question, right? I think, you know, of course, Europe has a little bit more capacity, perhaps in terms of cultural and historical proximity to Ukrainians. The Baltic states, for example, already kind of home to pretty significant Ukrainian minority populations. So perhaps there is some paths for integration there. But yeah, it is a difficult question, and we can return to more kind of pointed questions there.
Yeah, I think I asked this question just to kind of get to this discussion about the idea that, yes, you know, it's important to receive the refugees and give them the safe haven, but the ultimate solution to this is to end the war, to achieve a point of ceasefire, right? And to ensure that less, you know, there's less destruction, or the destruction ends, especially to the civilian infrastructure. And I want to turn this question over to Gabriela. There's a lot of discussion about establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and the implications of a no-fly zone. At least Putin has made it very clear, oh, well, that would mean that NATO is then at war with Russia. So then there's this discussion about a limited no-fly zone or a humanitarian no-fly zone. That's one option that we've heard discussed. Obviously, there has been no safe humanitarian corridor that has been established so far. Gabriela, can you walk us through some of these options that have been discussed, and also the idea of a no-fly zone, or even a limited / humanitarian no-fly zone?
Sure. I'm just going to put up a disclaimer here. My collaborator is Dr. Olya Oliker, so we may coincide in things that we say, and we have conversations constantly about this. So I'm just going to lay that out from the international crisis group. Actually, people are very much against it. I do believe that it would very much mean a war between Russia and NATO. I completely believe, because a no-fly zone would actually mean, also involves kind of attacking aircraft, air infrastructure. It involves attacking aircrafts on the ground, and particularly their support structure. And you also need to establish air superiority. And I think the big question that everyone's wondering is, who would establish this no-fly zone? Who is actually going to do it among the NATO members? And I think we saw that again with the whole jets discussion once more again. Who is actually going to carry it out, and who is actually going to do it? And I think actually the US is actually doing a very good job in trying to kind of level out the potential of escalation in this. However, you also mentioned a limited no-fly zone, but what does that really mean? I think this would be my main question to people proposing a limited no-fly zone. What does that entail? What does that really mean? And how can we accomplish it? So I'm going to spitball some ideas. They can be shot down by the brilliant panelists, or they can be against these ideas. But can we get a neutral party or a neutral country to actually facilitate humanitarian convoys and humanitarian corridors? Can we get them involved? Because Russia is a country that has a history of using ceasefires in order to accomplish its strategic goals. Clearly, another question, is it advantageous right now for Russia to do a ceasefire, considering there's so much pressure. And I'm going to cite a bit of Indra here when she said there's a bit of fatigue concerning the war. And currently, I think it's very clear that we've moved a bit from occupation to, as Rob Lee says, compellent, into how much destruction can you take until we go to the negotiating table. And another question that I'd like to put is Russia really ready to go to the negotiating table, considering they are about to launch an offensive on Kyiv? And if that would really be an advantage, that's what's going to take after that for them to actually come with reasonable demands. I think it's also worth, Russia has stepped down at face value. I say face value because I don't know what to take as real or not anymore, obviously, due to the situation, that they sort of recognize Zelensky as that, yes, that he leads the current government of Ukraine, which was completely different from what they were originally positioning. And meanwhile, the Ukrainian side has recently pointed out that, that DNR recognition is completely off the table. So is Crimea. However, we would be interested in a neutral status of sorts. Is that acceptable to Russia? Is Russia going to be happy with just that? Those are other questions. And what can Russia really offer? Are they going to completely take their forces away from Ukraine's territory? Are forces going to remain in the Donbass and in Crimea? I think there's a lot of questions here, and the situation is extremely fluid.
Thank you, Gabriela. And I think I have to agree with that one. So far, all the ceasefire negotiations that we've seen are just between the Russian and the Ukrainian side. Tomorrow in Turkey, Foreign Minister Kuleba of Ukraine and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia will meet for further negotiations. I personally just cannot imagine that anything useful will come out of it. Ukraine says that they will keep that door open, and every time there is an opportunity for a diplomatic solution or a negotiation, they will participate, but they too are very pessimistic. You're right, by all assessments, according to all assessments, Moscow is preparing to intensify its assaults on Kyiv itself. So I want to ask our panelists how they see these negotiations unfolding. If it's just these two sides that are going to keep on meeting sort of parallel to Russia's intensifying assaults on Ukraine, is it time maybe to introduce some other form of the negotiation formats? Eilish, do you want to go first?
Sure. I hate to say it, but I'm pretty pessimistic about negotiations because, well, first of all, I think if Russia was willing to negotiate or compromise on any of its demands, we wouldn't have a full-scale war in Ukraine, because the Ukrainian side has always been willing to negotiate, even when, what the negotiations were about was the war in the Donbass. And the other thing that makes me pessimistic about negotiations is that, the two sides are negotiating from two completely different official stances on what's happening. The Ukrainian side is trying to have peace talks to end a full-scale war. The Russian side is insisting that this is a limited, quote unquote, special military operation. They're claiming that they could, stop all of this on a dime if Ukraine would just comply with these, these demands to demilitarize and things like that. But I mean, the demands that Russia has been putting to Ukraine have been exactly the same since day one, and they know that no Ukrainian government is going to capitulate. And not just no Ukrainian government, but Zelensky's government is not willing to capitulate. And they've already said, even if they were overrun, that we would just see this spill over into like an insurgency, guerrilla warfare. So I hate to say it, but I'm pretty pessimistic about the prospect of negotiations, because the Russian side isn't even acknowledging the scale of the conflict that's going on. So I think in order for there to be any kind of negotiated solution, you would have to have some kind of, you would have to have international pressure, and you would have to have other parties at the table as well, because the negotiations we are seeing between Russia and Ukraine, they're not happening at the top. We've never seen Putin and Zelensky at the same table. And the negotiations we are seeing, like I said, they're for these kind of very specific humanitarian requirements that are the most urgent, but I don't think we're anywhere near to even talking about what a solution could look like.
Indra, I want to ask you, so Ukraine has submitted an application for EU membership, and there's a chance that Ukraine might receive a candidate member status from the EU. What's your anticipation? In addition to Ukraine, now Moldova and Georgia have done the same, right? They have submitted these applications for accelerated membership. What are you seeing how are the Europeans sort of looking at this? Is it seen as a liability, or do you think that there is a chance that they will actually grant Ukraine a candidate status relatively quickly?
I think that, well, right now, I believe it's quite on the table that this is a possibility. And of course, the Baltic countries, the Eastern European flank of the European Union has been pushing for this right? The PMs and presidents of those countries have submitted letters in support of Ukraine, of immediately granting candidate status to the country. And, kind of to zoom out slightly, right? This war is a huge wake-up call for Europe, but it's not a huge wake-up call for the Baltic states. It's not a huge wake-up call for the countries that border Russia and Ukraine in Europe. It is not a very new position really to be in support of Ukraine's kind of progressions towards the West, or even Georgia, Moldova's progressions towards the West, right? Like the understanding, especially from the Baltic states, right, which is my area of expertise, which is why I refer to them more directly, right, is that it is safer for Europe to be bordering stable Western-oriented democracies, right? Like that is the position, right? And of course, it would be really the dream for Russia to be a stable Western democracy, right? So support for these movements to align more closely with European Union, of course, has been a policy priority for the Baltic states for years, and you've seen many sorts of envoys go and kind of echo their support for Ukrainian candidate status. We kind of referenced this earlier, but this moment as a wake-up call, recalls a lot of historical traumas and historical memories of World War II, and that is really, really clear in the countries that were the bloodlands, right, in World War II, as Timothy Snyder put it, right, all of these countries on the eastern flank, and despite, I think, kind of what often comes up in American, perhaps, discourse around whether or not the West is provoking Russia in some way by expanding memberships or NATO membership to the Eastern European and Nordic countries. Like this is a kind of a ridiculous sort of statement in my opinion, because the whole entire point of expanding access to Western institutions is the promotion of democracy and freedom, and to kind of resign countries to being this, not even countries, to resign people to being the buffer between democracy and authoritarianism is, in my opinion, the furthest thing you can get from a democratic sort of liberal mentality without going all the way into authoritarianism. I think that this is again a wake-up call for Europe to understand that in order for its own stability and safety, providing access to democratic Western-leaning institutions is also a must for the people who want to be part of that.
Right. Thank you, Indra. Katia, Indra mentioned this movement or struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Just a year or two ago, we had the uprisings in Belarus, and it seems like the democratic forces have lost and have been on the losing side for a while. But do you see this war as perhaps an accelerating factor for destabilizing Lukashenko's regime? What is the status of the pro-democracy movement in Belarus and its democratic government in exile? What is their role and their take on the situation? Do you see perhaps this as this war as a major destabilizing factor for Lukashenko's regime stability as well?
Yeah, thank you, Maya. I think that, yes, definitely it is a further destabilizing force for the Lukashenko regime. As I mentioned in my presentation, I do think that Lukashenko, having dragged Belarus into this, is actually viewed very negatively, both with technocrats, but also with the security services. And again, we have sort of visual clues to that, something similar to what we saw in the meetings between Putin and his security apparatus. We saw very unhappy faces of the Belarusian officials. I think in Belarus, there is always this, again, it's very hard, to speak about kind of generalized notions, but because we don't really have many figures, so I would try to speculate and say that in Belarus there has been, because of this trauma and history of World War II, and the country was completely erased, and people left Belarus. Most of them left Belarus very, very early during World War II. There is this memory, even within the older generation, a very negative attitude towards the war. And I think the fact that Lukashenko has basically made Belarus a part of it must have resulted in him losing also some support within his remaining core electorate. But again, having said that, his support remains still very low. It has not grown since the stolen 2020 election. It's about 25%. So now probably he may have lost, I don't know, another 5 percentage point, maybe more. And I think the political effect is obviously very, has been very negative on him, both from within the government and from society. I think people in Belarus and within the government, they now have again a better realization that Lukashenko is not the person who should be at the helm of the country. At the same time, obviously, because of this high level of repression, there isn't really an opposition force or movement that is acting within the country. Even those few people who were now in Belarus, they left, and it's the leader of the democratic opposition movement, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, for example, she has called on people to mobilize into this kind of cross-national anti-war protest. And I think some people are definitely following her proposals, but many of her proposals, they have quite subversive nature. For example, sort of trying to disrupt railways work, trying not to let young men be drafted into the war. And I'm not sure that that actually has a lot of kind of practical response within society. Obviously, emotionally, people feel that this is the something right to do, but because of high level of repression, I don't think that people are prepared to do that. But I do think that to kind of summarize it, if we see some sort of regime change in Russia, which is probably very far, if it is there, it's somewhere very far on the horizon, I think that might kind of like a domino effect have an impact on Belarus. and Lukashenko being very close to Putin and now also obviously falling under this economic sanctions, I think that will be another key issue to monitor, how it will play out and develop in Belarus, because Belarus, unlike Russia, has not had so much of, in terms of international reserves. We know that Russian reserves are now blocked, the foreign currency, but Belarus has relied on Russia, and now it's very unclear whether Russia would be able to support Lukashenko financially. And the recent sanctions that have been increased on Belarus, they actually try to target all the loopholes that had been open. So again, that might push Lukashenko towards sort of, being a bit more open to negotiations with the opposition. But I think the probability is still not very high. So I would not be very optimistic at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you, Katia. I have a question from one of our audience members. No-fly zones and other military measures are difficult to implement and potentially escalatory, but there is a potential imperative for Western leaders to do something, which only becomes stronger with each Russian attack on civilians. Can the panelists comment on whether they believe there is a tipping point that might compel the West to intervene? And if so, what might it be? Gabriela, maybe you could start us off with this.
Very difficult question. I'm going to try to answer it, particularly because I think a lot of what we're talking about is really depending on what the outcome of the situation is going to be, and we don't really have a sort of idea of how that's going to turn out. I think there is a rising moral imperative because of the media coverage that Ukraine has gotten. I think that very much it is due to that. And I think a lot of people are indeed writing to their Congress people about this and are very passionate about it. However, I think that on the ladder of escalation, I think there needs to be some ground rules between Russia and NATO, since NATO has consistently said that it doesn't want to get involved. However, it's weird because it kind of does want to get involved. I'm Latin American, so I have a very different view about NATO and the United States. It does want to get involved by arming Ukraine at the cost of Ukrainian soldiers and at the cost of Ukrainian civilians. We could be seeing possibly, countries like Poland, in the case that, for example, that Zelensky needs to flee because he's in imminent danger. Let's just put a rhetorical. Are they actually going to do something? Are they going to form an insurgency of sorts? I come from a conventional arms control background, and I would actually need to say that there are definitely going to be some ground rules established between NATO members and Russia in terms of this. And I think they're going, and I think actually the signaling, despite how irresponsible President Putin has been in his own signaling, I think NATO members are actually quite communicating this, except for the mishap that happened yesterday about the jets. They've actually been communicating what are their particular red lines, and what are they willing to tolerate and what are they not willing to tolerate. I think this also really much depends on the media frenzy around the Ukrainian crisis. And while it is a tragedy, and yes, it is morally reprehensible what Russia is doing, disclaimer, I think that is going to actually play a very big deal into what the Western response is going to be. Because, and I believe, Indra, correct me if I'm wrong, but has the EU touched energy in terms of sanctions? The US has. Have they begun to touch those, particularly?
Yeah, the EU yesterday, I think, announced that they will attempt to draw down reliance on Russian energy by, I believe it was 2/3 by the end of the year, and it is accelerating Europe's Green Deal. But of course, you're totally right to point that out. That was a slow concession to make, and Europe has a huge energy dependence problem on Russia, right? It took literal war for Germany to cancel Nord Stream 2, right? Or at least to put a pause on Nord Stream 2, and that's something that Eastern Europe has been pointing to for years, that this is a real not only energy liability, but security liability for Europe, is to have this huge reliance. But yeah, it was slow in coming.
Yeah, I think something really important is visualization, and what is the policy going to be towards Russia with all of this? Is it going to be regime change, as the Baltic states clearly have expressed, or is it going to be completely isolating Russia? I think this is very important to note, because there are certain mechanisms in which that to use in order to avoid escalation, like what's going to happen to the substantial forces pledge, what's going to be and what's going and what are going to be the mechanisms to regulate it.
Thank you, Gabriela. Gabriela warned us about some Wi-Fi issues, so I'm sorry about the glitches, but I think we got the gist of your last statement. I want to add a couple more things. One is what we are seeing as obvious war crimes committed by Russia, especially, again, attacking civilian infrastructure, attacks on hospitals, kindergartens, so on and so forth. Lavrov very cynically dismissing those as collateral damage. In a recent interview, he just sort of bluntly said, Americans or the Westerners were the ones who created this term collateral damage, right? So I wonder, you know, when we look at the war crimes and war crimes prosecution afterwards, how much of this is going to depend or on whose interpretation, right? Because Russia sees so much of its war crimes as just collateral damage. And, you know, again, this goes back to this idea of how Russia sees and interprets things versus how the West does, because Russia has also offered these humanitarian corridors for Ukrainians to evacuate into Russia. So just sort of an added layer of, you know, I think people really need to understand that there's this counter narrative that Russia keeps trying to prop up, and it's having a great deal of effect on the Russian population's opinion of the war, especially as Russia keeps on shutting down its people's access to the outside world. So I'm going to bring this next question to Eilish, because, you know, I know you very closely monitor what's happening within Russia. And we have this question, what do you see as a potential catalyst that could compel Russia's general populace, various oligarchs, and different military personnel to challenge Putin over the war's direction? And again, I just want to add here that the information space continues to close, and the propaganda is amped up more and more. So that environment is, I think, helping prolong the regime and also keep down dissent as much as possible.
Yeah, you know, thank you for that question. It's a very difficult one, because what we don't have a good idea of right now is to what degree what's happening in Ukraine has popular support. And part of the trouble, like you said, is the framing. So we do have, you know, some polling data that's come out from government-controlled pollsters, of course, that are saying, you know, like 60% of Russians surveyed support the special military operation. Now, of course, you have to look at what question is being asked. When this is being presented to the Russian public, like I mentioned before, it's being framed as a limited special military operation to liberate, you know, regions of the Donbass. If you're watching Russian state television, you're not going to see images of, you know, the kind of destruction that's been leveled on Kharkiv, for example. You're not going to see images of, you know, people in Kyiv in bomb shelters. Like, that's not part of the framing there at all. I think, you know, we have seen anti-war protests in Russia. They weren't large by any stretch of the imagination. And at the same time, you've seen upwards of 13,000 people arrested at these protests. You've seen new legislation put in place that could have, you know, people serving up to 15 years in jail for spreading information that, quote unquote, discredits Russian military activity abroad. And of course, like you mentioned, the media space is closing. We've had dozens of outlets have their website blocked in the past week, including Meduza's own website. We've had newsrooms closed down. We've had major international outlets pull their correspondents out of Russia, including the New York Times yesterday announced that, which is unprecedented. Like they had a bureau reporting on the Soviet Union under Stalin. So, I mean, it's really hard to sort of measure whether or not there really is kind of popular support for this. At the same time, I mean, I think we definitely shouldn't overstate this kind of anti-war sentiment. I think because we're looking at these horrifying images of what's happening in Ukraine, we think to ourselves, like, how could anybody support this? And I think there's definitely a feeling in Russia that this is out of the population's hands. This isn't something, you know, that the Ukrainians accept. They definitely feel that there is a level of collective responsibility from the Russian population for Putin's actions. People don't see this just as Putin's war against Ukraine. But, you know, the degree to which anyone in Russia could challenge Putin directly, I mean, there doesn't appear to be room for that. And I think, you know, I think Julia Yaffe made a really good point in an article she wrote yesterday, is that, you know, you have this sort of narrative going around that if Putin were to drop dead tomorrow, all of this would end. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, Putin made sure that the top leadership in Russia took part in kind of this political theater, that they came on these public broadcasts and signed off on the recognition of these territories in the Donbass. You know, he kind of made sure that there was at least the image that there was support for this at the highest levels of government. So I find it very difficult to kind of expect regular people to challenge the direction the Russian leadership has taken when no one within the Russian leadership challenged it, right? So yeah, I think it's very difficult to assess. At the end of the day, you know, maybe this was all dreamed up in Putin's head and he was giving the orders, but the Russian military is still carrying out those orders. The Russian government is still making sure that this machinery runs and it works. They're trying to mitigate some of the economic fallout. So I don't think we should kind of assume that there's this underlying widespread anti-war sentiment that would just sort of topple the system if only there was an opportunity. I mean, it sounds very cynical to say, but I just don't think it's the case, unfortunately.
Thank you, Eilish. And I want to turn the same question over to Katia, because you mentioned earlier how this might negatively affect the Putin regime, but it would happen over time. How do you see the impact of this decision to go to war with Ukraine, to engage in this impossible war? How do you see that affecting the longevity of Putin's regime as we know it?
Sorry, is the question to me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think man, it's very hard to say. I have heard different opinions. You know, someone like, for example, someone who, like Fiona Hill, I mean, she said, who is sort of an expert on Putin's mind and, you know, what goes on within him. And she thought that if some sort of palace coup could happen, then it would be more a conservative coup, kind of looking at the history of Russia, that it would be more to further push down the war path. I don't see it this way necessarily. I think that people around Putin, they would be sort of, they would be less inclined to further clamp down, but I don't see anyone being able to stand up to Putin at the moment. I think a lot will depend again on the economic factor and on kind of public opinion in Russia. Waking up, and I think we have now very different views on what is happening within Russian society at the moment. It seemed like the figures from the Levada polls that were conducted just before the war still kind of showed this very high support of Putin's potential decision to go down this route. But again, different interpretations exist. Something that might have actually have to do with the Russian kind of successful, in quotation marks, operation in Kazakhstan, and now people are sort of waking up in Russia, seeing what is happening. But many people with whom I speak within Russia, they do support this military operation as they see it, unfortunately. So therefore, I think that we might see some changes in Russian public opinion, but not at the moment.
Right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I want to actually come back to Indra and the point that she made, which was Europe the West has a sort of a mixed record on refugees, and especially, with just this October, November, we had another refugee crisis at the border with Belarus. And Indra, you said that the optimist in you makes you think that maybe we'll have a different approach to humanitarian crises and to refugee crises going forward, now that we are experiencing the situation so close to home. So I want to thank you for making that point. I think we're all learning a lot from this situation. This is an incredibly humbling experience. At the end of the day, I think we can all just, the best thing that we can hope for is a lasting ceasefire and end to this conflict, so that Ukraine can begin to rebuild. But unfortunately, based on all assessments that I'm hearing, things are going to intensify before they calm down. So I want to ask our audience members to keep an eye on this space, keep an eye on our website, on our social media pages, fpri.org. We're going to keep covering the war from all perspectives as much as we can. So we just launched a new edition of BMB Russia. It's a military edition, so I strongly encourage everyone to sign up for that newsletter as well. I want to thank Katia, who had to run, Eilish, Indra, and Gabriela for joining me today in the first of many conversations we will have at FPRI about the war and the humanitarian crisis as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.